for the math that they're trying to explain, it's funny. It's actually it's phenomenally better than like an actual textbook on this stuff. Like I took physical chemistry, and there's a ton of statistical mechanics in it, and they just cannot explain those concepts at all. So like this was actually like I read this book and I was like, oh, that's what that meant. That's what I was supposed to know in my chemistry class.
No, I think that's very true. I mean, you can criticize Cockshot over plenty of things. He is very good at explaining things, I think, and breaking them down into their most basic, or getting good analogies at least. So let's go through this one piece at a time. Oh, that's my cord. But I have enough battery. It's been giving me trouble.
Okay, so we'll start with chapter 7.
Yes, and that's the simple simulation of money moving across an economy, which they just had random actors, random agents in the computer simulation. I imagine you could probably get a big matrix of different actors. Each one has a certain amount of money at the start. They can be equal. And if those actors just randomly exchange money for whatever goods or what have you, eventually what happens is that you get a Boltzmann-Gibbs distribution, just like the energy of particles in an ideal gas. And this is kind of the basis for they've used this basic simulation and build off of it to kind of further expand how like econophysics can be useful. And right now they're just working on the monetary level, right? So this isn't actually the wealth distribution. It's more similar to the income distribution. Really, it's just about money and not wealth, because wealth, like value, is well, it's not like a thing of. I mean, you can sell commodities. You have like all these goods in your house and stuff, right? That are not liquid, and not liquid value. And that's so he's just talking about money in that more liquid sense and what people have in their accounts. And this is different from the way, well, in the first chapter, in chapter 7, he's just kind of showing how this is different from the mechanical equilibrium that we're all taught in economics. Well, I think what he's actually showing is that there's kind of a bait and switch in economics, right? We talk in the economics classroom a lot about the way different actors might make decisions and all this stuff, and certainly there's a lot of lip service to how things change over time and move in equilibrium. But the equilibrium of mathematically that they use is always a mechanical equilibrium. And this is something that in the supplemental reading becomes very clear, that no one's really given a treatment for like a dynamic statistical equilibrium, which is what these two chapters are trying to do. So in a statistical equilibrium, like different parts of the system can be moving into like different parts of the distribution or whatnot. Everything's constantly moving, but the distribution itself always stays the same.
This is the key, I think, for understanding what statistical equilibrium is, and I'm glad that they do a good job of distinguishing that in the book.
Oh yeah, it's really helpful. And when did either of you guys get a chance to read the supplemental reading on this?
I did, and even that, like, I was grasping that a bit. I was just having a hard time seeing, like, I know that they mention it in the reading, and like where it's mentioned, but I'm still having like a hard time seeing the connection.
Right. So the way that Moshe and Mackover, Farjorn and Mackover approach this situation, what they were trying to do, and it's kind of similar to what this is doing because this is building off of that book, is figure out the transformation problem. And what they realized, looking at the assumption that profit rates will equalize, was that that doesn't make sense, right? That if you equalized all the profit rates in the economy, what would happen if you suddenly let all the prices freely move again? They would move away from that equalization. They would de-equalize. So when you have a real mechanical equilibrium out there, when you have, like, for example, the pendulum is a classic example. It's moving back and forth. But if you have the pendulum at its equilibrium, it's not going to move. And that's the difference between mechanical and statistical equilibrium. When you have a statistical equilibrium, it's still, like, the particles in an ideal gas are still moving all the time.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what Farjar and Mackover are getting at, is, and they do this, they show this in a lot of different ways. I really like how they show there's certain mathematical properties that this implies when you're using the math of statistical mechanics versus, like, Newtonian, or this, I guess in this case, economics is more like pre-Newtonian energetics. And yes.
If I could just interject, I'm sure that we covered this in the last session and maybe even in the last two sessions, but this is a key thing in the book, is that they're doing, like Farjon and Mactover, they're doing a probabilistic approach to, we can call it political economy or economics, as opposed to a deterministic,
right?
And as opposed to a deterministic model, and that is, I guess, supposed to be reflected in the math that they use. Could we go, because I feel fairly comfortable with the math, but could we just go over again what they mean by a deterministic model of the economy?
Right. So
which they are contrasting.
Right. So this is the way that economics has generally looked at. So let's go back to Econ 101, for example. And this is a thing for, like, all economics. What economics has generally tried to do is build a model of rational individuals, right? So when your first principles are that if we can figure out like what people will rationally do, like this is evident when you look at the Marshallian price cross, which is why you have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping demand supply curve. That's all built off of a rational model of the individual. But even if we didn't know that, this is still a deterministic model of how, like, if you're using this idea, which is how, like, when we get to the more macro models in economics today, they build it off of this. What they're doing is creating aggregate demand and supply curves. And it's supposed to all go back down to this rational, like utility theory. So you can't. So if you knew what people's utility curves were, and you knew what the supply curves were, you could generate an equilibrium for the economy, a single equilibrium that it's supposed to be all tending towards. And if it was to reach that equilibrium, it would just stay there mathematically. If you were to, like, follow the math of the model.
Do they realistically ever get there in their models?
I mean, well, I mean, here's the thing. If in terms of the model itself, people have tried to use this, like try to find solutions to like the aggregate supply and demand curves for like a bunch of commodities or whatever. They come up with a solution to general equilibrium. So in what proportion could all these goods and stuff be made that like the utility curves, the demand and supply curves meet and all that stuff? Is there a solution there that works such that every market is an equal, if every one of these smaller markets is in equilibrium? And the answer is sometimes yes, you can find solutions, but there's more than one solution. And the solutions are also unstable. So, and this is also a critique that Farjorn and Mackover make, which is the approximation of equilibrium will not like if you have something that's slightly out of equilibrium, it won't necessarily be like let me put this a different way. If you're close in terms of the math of of the supply and demand or whatever, but it's not quite there, the results of that may not be close to the actual equilibrium result. So you can't just say, oh, it's not exactly equilibrium, we're just making these assumptions. If it's not, if that's the case, then your model may have absolutely nothing to do with reality. Because your model, if reality is not at equilibrium, the results could be wildly different, even if the inputs are close in terms of reality in the model.
Gotcha.
I
think that was a very good, thorough, helpful, but huge tangent. But
yes, I hope so.
Very helpful.
I mean, when I read those passages and kind of that clicked for me, I was like, this like opened up a whole new world. I was like, what? Like, how come no one ever thought of this before? You know, because I mean, people think about this in like math and hard sciences all the time, but no one ever seems applied it to economics, really.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to be exclusively the realm of, I guess, Marxists and post-Keynesians, I think, are another one.
Oh yeah, I mean the post-Keynesian, but even the post-Keynesians, they've only really started doing this on a micro level. Like where's I'll be impressed if they can give us the macro level models that do this. But yeah, if they do, it'll just like, why not just read this book, you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, so given all that, once we create this model of these random actors exchanging money, and then we can actually create complications on that. We can create firms using a standard Cobb-Douglas production function, but presumably we could use different production functions and get similar results. What happens is markets will, assuming time symmetry, which you'll get, assuming time symmetry in the exchanges, you will get a maximization of entropy in terms of money. So money will naturally tend to be unequal, and be unequal in a way that follows the Baltz-Gibbs distribution. And when we look at income and wealth inequality, although it's not quite the same thing, we can approximate a bit. It will generally follow that curve until we get to the tail, which then takes on a Pareto distribution. And that's for the very rich.
Okay.
If we just, like, if we had market socialism, for example, then this would apply. Then it would income would strictly follow a like Boltzmann distribution.
And then does this treatment of, I mean, obviously the models are going to get a little more complex, but
yes,
can we apply this simple model? Is this just to national economies, or is this to the world economy as well?
well, he gets into that a little bit, and I'm actually a little bit. I'm still trying to work this bit out in my head. I don't think they've really expanded on this too much. They make a comment that presume that you can have two different economies, and what'll happen is like they'll have two different temperatures, basically, like assuming they do have two different temperatures, and the temperatures in this case being average wealth.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of funny how they kept the T.
Oh yeah, and then they keep the same symbols. But if those will eventually converge as you have trade between those two economies until the average wealth is about the same. And they make a comment. Obviously, it's more complicated because the money because the model is about money right now.
Yeah.
And the trade balances are determined more by like the factors of production relative we can see this in the profit-seeking behavior of capitalists and firms, that when there's a difference in development, they can take advantage of that and get profit out of it, and until like the levels of development are roughly equal. So like China was able to get a lot of growth because of this, and it's like they describe this kind of process as like a thermal machine, right? You can get a lot of profit and like from using these differences in development, which is why like China's growth is beginning to slow down. Obviously, there's weirdness this year because of the pandemic, but China's growth is slowing down and will converge to the rest of the developed world because of this. Because it'll reach equilibrium, thermal equilibrium, basically, with the rest of us.
Huh.
And in a way, like I'm seeing the beginnings of how you could use this to basically replace Smith and Ricardo's like inflation foreign exchange market model, which drives trade differences. It's not, I don't think it's worked out well enough to do that quite yet, but I could see how we could get there using this model.
I'm not skeptical. I'm just not read up on the literature of those models, but I am very much of the idea that economists can be corrected over time. So
yeah.
Is this able to account for things like intellectual property and copyright? So like that's why the US, for instance, because we have such a strong private property regime, has been able to exceed rates of growth compared to other developed countries over the last few decades.
Yeah, I think that in that sense, we would probably want to look a bit at like the monopolistic model that they put forth here, which is great that they do that, because one of the great, like in neoclassical economics, the whole thing is, oh, we've got this perfect competition. We need to introduce more, like we see how monopolies price things and oligopolies and all that kind of thing. And he kind of shows that if a firm could set its own prices, like intellectual property allows software companies and others to do, by giving them a monopoly, it will basically price things such that the money, like it'll price to get the most money, and if you knew the distribution of money, I mean, I could pull up the equation for it. It seems that like you could just get, you would just have to know how much everyone has past a certain point. Because if you set the price too high for like the customers to pay, then you're missing out on a bunch of like of what they have. So you want to catch as much of like the curve as you can. Besides that, I did. I had an interesting tangent I went on reading through this about the Lucas critique. Are you guys familiar with that?
I've read it here and there. I'm not like super intimately familiar with it. I think it has to do. It either has to do with growth or it has to do with, isn't it like importing microeconomic concepts to model the macro economy?
Yeah, that last part is basically it. The Lucas critique is mostly aimed at Keynesians and like the Phillips curve kind of studies that look at historical data and try to extrapolate that into the future. And it says that because policy can change the way actors work, that you can't rely on historical data like that to make policy changes. But there's a second level to that, which is the right way to do models is you have to go from first principles. You have to go from the model. You have to properly model the individual and how potential changes could affect them and their preferences. And you have to do all that on the micro level in order to make macro predictions. And this whole 2 chapters is a great counter critique of that, I think, which is you don't need to know like the rationalist way that like people will respond to everything. You can treat people's individual consuming press preferences and things like that as random variables. And you kind of have to in order to get effective macro models like this. Because, I mean, whether decisions are rational or irrational, we do not have enough information, especially like economists, do not have enough information to know how exactly people will respond. You have to treat these as random, basically. And that still allows you to create models that have like some predictive power just based off of the laws of statistical mechanics and like the structural properties that we're talking about. So besides all that, we can also, did you guys get a chance to look at the more heat than light section?
Yeah.
What did you think of that?
I was only able to briefly skim it, but I thought it was doing a really good job of showing the connection in the sort of failure in neoclassical economics to apply these different type of energy analogies to itself, and like then it's sort of in this like wasteland of like what do we really do now?
Right. I guess in that sense, like I mentioned in the chat this morning that there's actually a reference to Murawski on this topic right here, which I did not notice the first when I included the supplemental reading. But yeah, this stuff has basically, I mean, neoclassical economics, because, well, let me put it this way. Murawski's claim specifically is that neoclassical economics developed from these pre-thermodynamics to energetics, and there's lots of historical evidence for that. There's a second claim that neoclassical economics can't get out of this without admitting like that like can't get out of the staticness of these models, because if they do, you introduce the problem of thermal equilibrium and the idea that the economy may be tending towards something, which is, I mean, Schumpeter kind of thinks the same thing. I haven't read too much of him, but his belief was also that the economy tends towards socialism, capitalism tends towards socialism, which it seems to be like he didn't. I don't think he really used Marx's same logic, but if you think that the economy has certain tendencies like that, then you're going to open up the problem of, well, what does it look like when we've finally reached the end point, you know, when we've reached thermal equilibrium? And profit rates is one thing. I mean, and even if you stop to think about like perfectly competitive models, it doesn't I mean, the neoclassicals can't take their model seriously, but at the same time, they can't move beyond them, because doing either of those things creates problems. You have to kind of do the Paul Krugman kind of thing, which is very popular now and has been for the past 10 years or more. You got to finagle it, introduce all these little basically epicycles or what have you, and imperfections in order to say, well, now we've really got it. It's just all these things that get in the way, not even of utopia, but in order to get like the imperfection of the world. But at the same time, it loses pretty much all its explanatory power, because you can finagle these things any which way, and they do, to support any policy and any kind of worldview. Which, I mean, you can use that as supporting worldview, but if you can't even agree on the model for that, that's a problem, you know? There should be a simple way of understanding this, like the macro economy, without having to result to all these things to even approach reality. Which is why I love this stuff, because you can take the Boltz-Gibbsman distribution, you can take the predictions of this model, and you can look at the income distribution of actual economies and see the application right there. Sorry for ranting about that for a bit, if that makes any sense. I don't have too much more. Was there any other specific questions you had about the model or the math? I might be able to help, I might not.
Not as far as chapter 7 goes. I found chapter 7 to be very straightforward.
Yeah.
That math I could basically follow. It gets a little heavier in chapter 8.
Yes, I agree it does. I had trouble with chapter 8 as well. I mean, it's some interesting stuff there with like the time symmetry thing, and the different possible distributions. The important takeaway I got was that the different distributions are still linked to important assumptions about the economy, right? So, like, for example, the one that introduced a VAT tax and UBI had a different had predictably different income distribution, where the population of people with low amounts of money was much smaller. So you could use that, I guess, as an argument for UBI and the VAT tax, that this would put a much, well, it wouldn't quite put a floor under poverty, because people could still gamble away their money or what have you, but it would greatly decrease severe poverty, even with the entropy maximizing tendencies of the economy, of the market economy. I mean, was there anything in particular that was troublesome?
Beyond specific math, which the onus is on me at that point. No, I get a sense of, you know, what they're trying to do, the uptake, where they're going with it. We're just given like a very basic model here. We're talking about money. We're not talking about wealth.
Right.
There could be various assumptions regarding employment and wages and how these things affect the transfer of money. But no, I was actually kind of amazed at how useful not only statistical mechanics, but also scientific analogies, like, and analogizing it to an ideal gas system wasn't like that ludicrous of a thing. You know, it was actually incredibly helpful.
Oh, right. I mean, that table in there is so incredibly, like when you think about it, it makes sense why you would do this, right?
Yeah.
Because what I was describing at the beginning here, like you could just as easily be a model for an ideal gas. What economies and like these models of gases have in common, there's lots of individual actors that have several degrees of freedom. I mean, the money conservation thing is an interesting assumption, which it looks like they're going to trouble when we get to the section on banking. But the foundation, like the assumptions are pretty decent assumptions, and certainly better assumptions, like more general assumptions, more reasonable assumptions than you get in a lot of neoclassical papers.
Yeah, that's why, you know, you go into this thing skeptical of economics in general, because neoclassicals do all these weird things. They take all these weird assumptions. And so I was approaching this with like a huge level of skepticism in terms of just, can we generalize in this way? Or but no, you're right. No, these are very general assumptions that they seem very flexible, and yeah, like I found it to be actually like, okay, this is sort of believable.
Yes.
And useful in its way.
I mean, it's I think
like the big difference between random versus rational actors, I think, is huge.
Oh yeah. And I mean, you can't, with the degrees of freedom that people have in an economy, the rationalist assumption is kind of absurd. And even the experimental assumption is kind of absurd. Like, even if you know how people act in like the lab, given the like real circumstances, there are degrees of freedom that you cannot have in that situation, that by virtue of studying it, you just can't include. And which is my problem with the new like econophysics stuff, because a lot of it hinges on behavioral psych. So you can use these better math, more correct math, to describe people's rational behavior, which is what a lot of it is doing right now, or even their irrational behavior. But when you have the degrees of freedom that we have in the you need something like this. You need statistical mechanics on that much higher level.
Oh yeah, it's yeah, this makes way more sense than whatever most macroeconomists are doing today.
Yes.
I thought that the section in chapter 8, where they try to incorporate debt, where they're still just talking about money, but they're incorporating debt and how that modifies the numbers, the parameters, and the numbers and the math a little bit. I thought that they did a pretty good job there of explaining like what kind of alteration that would be. Again,
Oh yeah.
just like if you're bad with math, like you would just read it once and walk away, have a beer or something, come back, and it's so much more crystal clear compared to like math textbooks or physics textbooks.
The debt assumption, on first glance, you would think that it would break the money conservation assumption that they're making, but if you know something about accounting, it really doesn't. Because when you create a debt entry, it's just subtracting from one account and adding to another. So
Right.
like the total amount of like value or money or whatever is conserved. Like the only thing that changes is the structural and institutional constraints that they talk about, which is bankruptcy laws, how banking institutions actually function, those kind of things, which impact the like whether or not money is actually created or destroyed. Which you could probably still model in this way if which I'm sure they'll probably get to. So I don't really have much else, but if there's anything else you guys want to talk about, uh, let's get it out.
I guess what will remain to be seen for me is once we add more layers of complexity, whether the random assumption will still hold. Like whether I agree that the neoclassical assumption of rational actors is bad. And then it'll remain to be seen for me whether the random assumption of actors it'll be better, but whether it will be able to create a accurate model.
Well, I think that the thankful thing for us is that Cockshott et al. Are classical economists still, political economists, and Marxian economists, and they don't just have to rely on the individual assumption of the actors. They can look at, they can look at the institutional stuff, and they can look at, as we'll see later on, labor hours, and see how that, the real division of labor in the economy as the attractor of where prices and everything goes. So, unlike the neoclassical economists, they'll look at this stuff. They'll look at supply chains. Some of them will, at least. But I think that's still more of an art than a science, really. The best you get are like indexes of different stuff that the Federal Reserve puts together, which are decent at like tracking the economy and growth and stuff like that. But in terms of a theory of value, in terms of not just growth, but the sectoral and pricing aspects of the economy and the classes and profit and all that kind of stuff, you still need the labor theory of value, which is why a lot of the book is devoted to it, and not the assumptions about the individual actors as much. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, then it's 45 minutes. I think we can call it here. Sound good?
Sounds good to me.
All right,
Good talk.
then we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
Yep.
Sounds good.
All right, bye.
Bye, everyone.